Thank you so much. Now I can see myself as well, so I'm too close to the camera. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction as well, Christian, and thank you, Nico, for the invitation to present today. And really to the audience, I mean, I'm absolutely flattered and amazed at the collective unity that obviously as the United Architects of Philippines has. I mean, it was very interesting to see even the building there, the headquarters building. It's a very serious organization, I can see, and it gives me great honor to have an opportunity to present some material to you today. I understand I have about an hour of time, and I would encourage to try to keep the session a little bit interactive. I mean, bearing in mind that there are some upwards of towards 1,000 people on the call. So I think probably the thing to do would be to use the private chat perhaps and send it maybe some questions to Christian or to Nico if you have any, and they can pass them on to me. Just simply that we don't get too many at the same time. But I'd be quite happy to answer things as we're talking. So as Nico mentioned, the focus of today's presentation is the Office of the Future, but I thought I would take a slightly broader view and just talk a little bit about our firm, a little bit about my personal development as an architect. I understand there's a lot of students on the call, and I want to make sure that that there's some kind of benefit to them in terms of potentially plotting their career and how they might go about doing that, whether in Philippines or in any other part of the world. And then I would like to finish off, after looking at a few projects, talking about the designs and so forth, with a look at the Office of the Future, and maybe show a couple of movie clips and things along the way. So I think you just keep me in check. Let me know if I'm overrunning. Let me know if any issues with the audio or if something needs to be made more clear. I'm assuming that everybody speaks pretty much fluent English, so I'm not going to go too slow, but please let me know if I should slow down or if the audio quality is poor. Okay, well, with that, I'd like to share my screen, and I'm going to share the screen now.
So Ben, if you want to like visit the Philippines in the future after this COVID thing, I think there's a lot of people that's gonna willing to host you and show you around.
Okay, excellent.
We have like everybody from north to south. We have a representative here, so it's
excellent.
Quite
well,
nice,
look,
yeah.
I would love to do. I'd love to visit the Philippines. I hear it's an absolutely beautiful country. And with such diversity and so many islands and from north to south, contrast and different foods and everything. So it would be a great pleasure for me to visit Philippines. And I think it's also very important to mention that Philippines and the United Architects of Philippines and what that represents is very important for the global architecture profession. I mean, the Filipino architect has an excellent reputation anywhere in the world. And that's based on a long history of dedication and professionalism. And I think certainly from all of the Filipino architects that I've ever had the pleasure of working with, it's been without exception, a wonderful experience. And much of the work that I'm presenting today has been done in collaboration with Filipino architects, not least of all Nico, who's on the call. So feel free to chime in on some of those projects. So let me just go to the full screen, and I want to make sure that everybody can see the. Feel free to chime in on some of those. Yeah, hold on. Close this one. Review full screen mode. So just want to confirm that everybody can see the screen clearly?
Clear.
Right. Poster had also going to talk about some other projects from my past career, which are not from Killa design, but I think are kind of interesting. They were interesting lessons for me in my development as an architect, and I think they may be beneficial to talk about. So let me talk first about Killa design and what kind of firm we are. Well, we're dedicated to projects that are environmentally sustainable. I think that in a sense, it goes without saying that we try to do that. I think all architects have a great responsibility, since we wield so much material and so much energy and so much responsibility in terms of the future of people that occupy our buildings. And I remember as a student once discussing with a friend about how architecture is this incredibly generous profession where essentially you're designing spaces to try to improve the lives of people that you never meet. But there's something inherently satisfying in that, that you're creating a framework for living that will last hopefully a very long time, that literally improves people's lives. And doing something that's very tangible. It's not about the talk, it's about the action. And there's nothing more of an action than building and shaping the world. And that's a wonderful thing about architecture. We as a firm and personally as an architect, we like to challenge the norm. You know, there is a difference between building and architecture. Building is about creating the requirement for accommodation, let's say, environmental protection. But architecture, by definition, has a bigger idea behind it. Some kind of higher level concept that is expressed through the building. And often this is some kind of little experiment or some kind of challenge within the project of trying to meet the requirements of two contrasting things, and how to make those things come together in a unique way is often what creates the architecture. So there's this very interesting dimension of technicality, but what really turns a building into architecture is some kind of a bigger idea, and that's what we like to do. One of the things that we are inspired by is the context. And I think it was mentioned just then in Christian's summation of the vision of the United Architects of Philippines, is this idea of respecting context. The wonderful thing about buildings is that they do last a long time, hopefully last longer than we do ourselves. And they are in a way a vessel of cultural development. They are physical parts of the culture, and that we try as much as possible when we build something new, that we don't do it blind to what has come before. And in fact, many times historical buildings have been very intelligent and evolved for their particular environment, and so they give very nice cues as to how to design buildings. At the same time, by looking to the past and the history and the context, we like to think about the future. We like to think about new technologies and what those might mean for architecture. In many ways, architecture is dealing with things that are eternal: public and private space, daylighting, views. In a way, for many thousands of years, the requirements of architecture haven't changed. But if you think about the development of technology and new materials, the opportunities to respond to those eternal questions have changed. And that's something that we like to do. At the same time, while including technology, we want those buildings not to be based on sort of fashion or a fad, but something that in 50 years, in 100 years, in 1,000 years, people will look at as being timeless, that they were honest and authentic in design responses, not pretending to be something that they weren't, but really just responding on first principles to those eternal questions of architecture. And ultimately, as I was saying before, it's all about being driven by this generous approach to enhancing the lives of the people that actually inhabit our buildings. And in terms of the different sectors that we cover, it's quite a wide range, but probably in terms of our largest portfolio area is mostly within resorts and hotels. We also look at master planning and urban design, mixed-use developments, residential, and culture and museums. And one of the things I would like to mention here, particularly in relation to master planning, is that we have these different names for different parts of design. Maybe we say, well, this guy's a master planner, this guy's an architect, this lady's an interior designer. But at the end of the day, design is all a continuum. And those different roles are just different parts of the continuum. And the best designs are really where those roles overlap, and that the engineer and the architect, the landscaper, the master planner, the interior designer, they're all working on quality design, and that they all feed off of each other. And it's a little bit like, you know, the chemistry that you get in a band. The music that comes from a band is the result of that relationship and chemistry between those individuals. And I think that one of the things to bear in mind in design in general is that it is about the chemistry of what's happening in any given team. So in our team, we have about 83 staff now, people from all over the world, which is wonderful. Dubai is a very multicultural place. And I think we probably have, I would estimate, maybe 1/4 Filipino architects in our office. And what I really like about our office is that culturally we're very blended. There's not like camps of the guys from the UK or the guys from Philippines. It's all one office, one family. And we have Filipinos getting involved in conceptual design, getting involved in the site delivery, technical aspects. And we really appreciate the members of the United Architects of Philippines do within our office. And here's a couple of views. It was great, Christian. I don't know where you found it, maybe off the internet, but to see the video again, it's been a while, and some good memories there.
Yeah, some good memories.
There's it's interesting that Google, Google offices are quite famous for being great places to work. And actually what Google realized is if you make offices more comfortable than people's homes, people will stay and work longer. So they have the juice and they have the, nice lunch and things like that. And we have a little bit of a Google vibe going on. Not that we expect people to stay all hours, but that if they do stay all hours, that at least it's not the kind of corporate kind of environment where you don't necessarily feel comfortable. And in fact, since the sort of COVID thing has kicked off and there's been far less clients coming in and things, we're very casual in the office. And you can see this sort of blend of, the kitchen right in the middle of the design space, and we go sailing, and we try to kind of merge our social life and our work life. Because essentially what we do it because we love it. Of course, it pays the bills, but ultimately the motivation, what gets us up in the morning, is that we want to build beautiful buildings that make a difference to people's lives. And that ultimately is why we do what we do. A couple more pictures here. There were some complaints about the table football because it does get pretty noisy. And I think Nico and I were trying to do some Excel spreadsheets sometimes with that thing banging off. So there was a rule that football after 6 o'clock and music after 6 o'clock. And
no playing when the client is around.
And no playing when the client is around, yeah. And as I'm sure everybody on the call appreciates, architectural offices don't really close at 6. It's quite rare.
6 in the morning, yes.
Yeah, 6 in the morning. We have a sofa if you need to sleep over. So again, I think for more the experienced architects, you probably have a good idea of what we do on a daily basis. But I think for some of the students and maybe people that are just starting in the professional workplace, it's kind of worth mentioning a little bit about how we work. So in our particular firm, we have architecture, obviously, as a core discipline. We also have structures. It's a requirement to have structures as part of the office in the UAE because architecture and engineering is not really seen as two separate disciplines. And in fact, the authorities are very keen to make sure that there's one point of responsibility should anything go structurally wrong with the building, because of course this is a major issue. So for that reason, in Dubai, and it may be similar in Philippines, you have to have a structural component to have the local license to be able to operate and liaise with the Dubai municipality, even if it's just on a pure aesthetic design. We also have a project management section, which is maybe about 4 or 5 people. And that's really to help in the process of the lead consultancy, because architecture is one of the disciplines that I spoke about before. But of course, as architects, we tend to be the lead discipline as well. But it's important that there's a differentiation. The role of the architect and the role of the lead discipline or the lead consultant are slightly different. Essentially, the difference is that as the lead consultant, we're also responsible for the performance of our sub-consultants. And because that starts getting a bit commercial, we need to have a design management team to make sure that the commercials are working and that people are actually delivering what they have agreed to deliver. The architecture team still looks at the work from a technical standpoint, but the design management team brings it all together and also helps package everything for the ultimate client. And we also have site supervision. So, you know, in any office, there's different periods depending on, let's say, different periods of growth. So we've now been established for about 5.5 years. And as everybody knows, it sometimes takes a while to get things out of the ground. So we're at an interesting stage now where we have quite a number of projects about to complete from that sort of 5-year growth period. And the site team has grown quite a bit. So this is actually a photo taken last week on the top of the Jumeirah Gate project, the highest infinity pool in the world. Unfortunately, it was a bit of a hazy day. You can't really see much of the background there, but it's always an awesome feeling to stand on the sort of 73rd floor of this, you know, massive twin tower and be like, wow, you know, a couple of years ago, this was just drawings and a BIM model. And there it is, all in concrete and steel. So we work with some wonderful consultants. You may have come across these in your own work. And one of the advantages of actually having our sub-consultants out of the office is that we can pick and choose and make teams for particular jobs. So for example, if there's a job that has a really big landscape component, we'll choose a very strong landscape consultant. But if it's just a little bit of greenery on a podium, we can just, you know, we can manage it ourselves. And so it's really customized for the particular job. And of course, there's many specialists that you don't need for every job, whether it's a pool specialist, a spa and gym, transport and traffic. These are the kind of guys that we bring in. But one thing that we take pride in is, as a firm, we're less interested in the brand name and we're more interested in the actual individual. And oftentimes when we work with a sub-consultant, we'll make a note and remember just through the experience, oh, that was a great engineer. That was a guy who knew about acoustics. That was a lady who understood marine works. Let's follow that person and work with them through the rest of their career. And not so much about the firm, but more about the individual. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the individual that sort of takes care. So I wanted to just start running through some examples of work. What I've done here, there's a lot of work that I could have presented from Killa Design, but I've been quite careful to try to select things that are essentially projects that I was involved with and know, let's say, more deeply and more of the backgrounds. So this was quite an interesting job, which was a master planning opportunity. Pre-crisis, actually, you know, back in 2009, and Satwa, who I'm sure many of you would be very familiar with. Satwa in Dubai is a very Filipino district. Actually, I think it's a great place. It's got wonderful atmosphere, nice Filipino foods, and there's a kind of real vibe in the street, a lot of activity. But there was a plan by the Dubai government to really extend the high-rise of Sheikh Zayed into that area. Sorry, say again?
It's okay. You can.
Yeah. And you can just see here, this was probably the beginnings of it's a bit of a low-res image, but the very early stage museum of the future kind of idea, some kind of a cultural building for Dubai with the calligraphy on the outside and everything. So some other master planning projects. This one was in Saudi. And I think one of the things that's often quite challenging, let me see if I've got another image here. Yeah. So one of the things that's often quite challenging, particularly in the Middle East region, is that cities are being developed so quickly and often in areas that don't have any urban context. I mean, we talk about context, and that's fine if there's a little infill building or maybe a plot that's surrounded by other plots. But when you are asked to design a new city on 2 square kilometers in the middle of the desert, it's very hard to be contextual. And you have certain things like the environment, the angle of the sun, perhaps the orientation to Mecca, and these kinds of things, which we took into account in this design. But more often than not, it becomes a case of trying to optimize the design in a pure numbers way, which is fine, and it's part of the story about making plots efficient and minimizing road area and maximizing the parking. But that isn't really what gives a quality to a city. And in this particular project, what we decided to do was to create an artificial kind of contextual disturbance, you could call it. And we were actually looking at a map of, I think it was London at the time. Oh no, Venice, sorry, Venice. So Venice has this big canal that goes right through the center, and the whole city has the reverberation of the shape of this canal because it has a knock-on effect to the roads and all of the geometry. And if you take cities like New York, for example, which is a very rational city, Manhattan, it's laid out on a grid. But there's certain areas, for example, 42nd Street, that cuts at a diagonal across the grid, and it creates these unique kind of spaces. And those spaces, like, for example, the Flatiron Building, which I'm sure you've seen, or Madison Square Gardens, these are spaces that are the disturbance of the grid, or the disturbance of the optimization. And as I said before, that's where architecture and design really starts to shine, because it's not just about doing the most optimal thing. It's doing something optimal and then bringing a kind of a design spirit to it, shaking it a little bit, giving it some tension between what is optimal and what is experiential. So in this particular case, we just decided to make this curved road here, and then to make a curved park going in the other direction. And those two moves set against an urban grid create all sorts of interesting opportunities and new kind of types of spaces. And I think whenever you're designing something like a city, variety is very important. There are many hundreds of thousands of different people, all with their own different requirements, all with their own different ages, and even the same person will have different requirements at different times. So it's extremely important that cities have this layered quality, that they are not just a single function, but they're truly mixed use, in the sense that the same spaces can be used for many different things, and even buildings encourage bringing together different uses in the same space. Of course, what we don't want in cities is to be stuck in a car driving from one place to another because the use of your building is not as you would need it. The ideal, I suppose, is that people don't need to get into a car to kind of get on with their daily lives. If it's a special trip, fine, but this would massively reduce the amount of traffic on the roads and things. And these are some other kind of master plans along similar lines. But I mentioned before that hotels is probably one of the key interests in the firm. And this was actually a hotel that I designed the concept for. It was based on an existing design for the downtown address, which you can see just in the foreground here. And one of the constraints on this job was that we need to get building very, very quickly, within about 2 or 3 months. And so the requirement was to keep the floor plate more or less the same, but to re-elevate the building and to redesign the podium, which was actually quite a useful constraint in a way, because oftentimes there's so many different ways to come up with a building plan that you spend all the time on the planning and less time on the elevating. In this case, we had a frozen plan and we did many options. I think there were about 14 different options on the elevation. But there was only one single brief from the chairman that we had, and it was modern classic. Now, we are, as a Killa design, and in terms of my own taste, I would say I am more of a contemporary architect that is more interested in the natural expression coming out of the constraints of a job. But because the client was asking for modern classic, we wanted to bring some kind of sense of classic New York style, these kind of vertical lines, and even the two aerials on the top were put there quite intentionally to relate to the existing downtown and to the Burj Khalifa. So when you drive around the city today, they do actually work as a kind of a trio, speaking somehow a similar kind of language. And my colleague Billy, I remember Billy Infante, a great Filipino architect and an absolute guru in SketchUp. I mean, this was many years ago, but he was, I remember these elements on the facade were a component. And we put them there more or less as a kind of a plastic. And it was nice to see them years later up in lights and having this sort of arabesque quality on the side of the building. One of the things that we really tried to do, let me see if there's an image that that conveys that, is to try to keep the facade slightly curved. One of the things about towers, large towers, is that they're generally seen in profile and as a sort of a dark shape against the sky, unless you can capture the sheen of light across them. And one of the beautiful things about Burj Khalifa is that it has this gentle curvature, and that's something that we wanted to pick up on this building. And if you have the opportunity to pass by, you'll notice that the very ends of the building, the very sharp curves, let's say tight radius, not sharp, tight radius curves, are actually done in curved glass quite intentionally, because if they were faceted, it wouldn't give that sense of sheen on there. But by putting curved glass on the two sides, it gives the whole building a more kind of curvilinear quality. Another project that I think probably the interesting thing here is this idea of contextually responsive. This was a project in Mumbai, which of course is in India. And there's all sorts of cultural cues, I suppose, and even inspirations in India, particularly in the architecture. But one of the things that is quite striking about Indian architecture today is that it's generally the historical buildings that we recognize, like the Taj Mahal or maybe India Gate from Mumbai. And the intention here was to try to make a building for India that was contemporary, but could be recognized instantly as Indian. And we were inspired by the Taj Mahal, which has a beautiful curved shape against, and I'm sure you've all seen the postcards and things, this beautiful curved shape against the sunset or the sky. But as you approach the Taj Mahal, there's this extra layer of finesse, like white on white marble, floral patterns and incredible intricacy. And the idea of this building was to use a graphic print to give that level of detail. And as you come closer to the building, it reveals smaller and smaller patterns within patterns, working at the human scale as well as the urban scale. The shape itself, we actually had an intern working with us at the time from Mumbai, and he drew a little picture of some hands like this, quite literal, almost like huge Buddha hands coming out of the ground. And he said we could make a tower called Namaste, that's the symbol of welcome and hospitality in India. And we thought, well, we're not sure about the hands part because it's very literal, but it's an interesting narrative concept. And in the end, we were inspired by that and this idea of the hands being decorated in the patterns, in the Mendi henna patterns, which is traditionally used in the weddings there. And I think this idea of narrative is very important. Whenever you're presenting to a client, you know, there's an infinite number of buildings that they could choose. And oftentimes, if a client is not so technically oriented, they may not understand, you know, the efficiency of a plan or the cost per square meter of different approaches of construction, but they will understand a narrative like this building is this shape because of this idea of hospitality in India, Namaste. And often it takes that kind of simple narrative to be remembered, let's say if it's a competition, and to clinch the deal and make a client have the confidence to move forward with a decision. So let me just zoom out here. So this was the kind of Mendi pattern that I mentioned, which was the inspiration for the skin. And the idea is that as you zoom in closer and closer to this paisley pattern, that it's like a fractal, that even the smallest parts of that pattern are made up by the pattern itself. This was Jumeirah Gate, which I mentioned before. It was the picture where we're standing on. Let me just zoom in a little bit. And then this is a building that I had the pleasure of putting together with Nico. And Nico, feel free to pitch in if you would like to say any words on this particular.
Yes, of course. Yeah, after you, yes.
So what we wanted to do in this project, it is a mixed-use project, basically apartments in the tower that you see at the top, and then we have a hotel in this slab building, and then we have the Dubai Marina Yacht Club, which is just above the Vida here, and then we have some retail. And in contrast to the Namaste, which I just showed you, which is one kind of shape, and then the different program just fits into that shape, there was a specific idea here to let the shape of the building reflect the program. So if, for example, you were one of like this couple on the boat looking at the building, you can actually have a conversation and say, maybe we should go to the yacht club, or why don't we go and check out that retailer? Maybe let's check into the hotel, or let's go and visit our friend up in the penthouse there. So you can kind of read the organization of the building from its elevation and from its design. And I think this is kind of an interesting thing, because ultimately, if you rely on a sign to tell you where to go in a building, you're, in a way, you're failing, I think, as architects. If you have to walk into a lobby and ask for where's the elevator, where's the toilet, it should be self-evident. And this was a bit of an exploration into that idea of making the different parts clear in the organization.
Yeah, also, Ben, if I may add,
Yeah, sure.
because Ben is our main designer for Vida Hotel. One thing I've noticed is this is now in 32nd floor already, but those things, the concepts that you and I are discussing on the concept stage, is working in reality now, like the view corridors and the circulation of the people. Like, I'm really surprised because, oh my God, this is working actually. So it's from the sketches, from the models, and now to reality. It's like, okay, now this is actual architecture that is working, and it's serving the purpose. And this is all made in BIM, like everything from architecture to structure to MEP to facade, and this is like everything 100%. All the documentation are extracted from BIM. And then I remember that you pushed us not to cut corners, do it properly, and now it's getting built. So I'm just happy about it.
Yeah, sure. And I think, I really do believe that different buildings have different spirits. It's like in the people call architecture frozen music, and I used to think, what are they talking about, frozen music? But actually, when a piece of music is written, it is written at a moment in time. It's not outside of time, and the state of mind of the people making that music, or the composer or whatever, is somehow captured in that piece of music. And it's the same with architecture, that it is essentially a dynamic thing. This could have turned out in many different ways, but there were some sort of ideas, there were some conversations, and then those ideas and conversations have found themselves formed in concrete today. And that, I do believe, perhaps it's more that other architects read it more easily, but I think even non-architects feel the vibe or the spirit of a building in a sort of a background way, just in the same way that you can still understand music without being a musician. You're still emotionally affected by it. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about architecture, that you can actually lift people's spirits, for that it's like it's permanently playing because it's an experience that you walk through. Obviously with music, you have to play it on some kind of a recorder or something like that. But one of the things I wanted to mention here is that sometimes we do make compromises. I mean, we had a nice idea, which was switchback balconies. And the idea here was that because the balconies were so large, we didn't want them to be dark. And so we actually projected some balconies out to make a double height space. And then they would go back and be opposite to each other. And there was even the idea that, when you live in a tower, you don't really get to know your neighbors because you don't have any kind of shared physical space, maybe the corridor, but that's not really a place to get to know people. Whereas if you live in a villa, you have your kind of garden wall, you might say hi over the garden wall. And there was an idea in this project that we could create stronger social links between people by having areas of the balcony that were visible from one to the other. But unfortunately, the client was a little bit concerned of what that might mean. Maybe some users wouldn't like it. And so in the end, it was a bit unfortunate, but we had to straighten out the balconies. And that's the way it's being built today, a bit more conventional. But you do find that, architects, we like to take a few risks, but clients will often take the slightly less risky road because it is, at the end of the day, their money. In fact, I think this was the image that I meant to show. You can see the difference here. So this was the original balcony kind of idea, and then the simplified one. But we managed to keep the penthouse projecting at the top there. That didn't get changed. And I think in terms of, I always find it quite interesting that the different shapes of a plot, I mean, creativity comes out of constraint. I'm a big believer in that. And in fact, the more constraints you have, the more creative you have to be. And that's why you often see great architecture that's actually produced with very limited budgets, because people have to think in a different way and use different kind of materials or different kind of processes because they're forced to. In this particular site, it was very, very narrow, because the site was originally only intended to be for a yacht club. So it's only 20 meters, I think, in the middle portion. And the site is also curved. So one of the things that is quite nice about the podium is that it takes this gentle curve. And even the restaurant, fills out there was one little extra piece of land that we managed to fill out. I think that it's also nice if one's buildings can play a slightly larger role. Of course, we want to make the occupants' lives better, but if we can make the city life better as well, that's a good thing. And sometimes it's just simple ideas. So this particular idea was that there's a metro station behind the project. And in fact, even when I came involved in the project, I didn't realize that the Bimarini Yacht Club and all of the life of the water was so close to the metro, because there was a building in between and you never saw to the water. So the idea here was to actually create a hole in the ground floor of the building with this grand cascading staircase, which wasn't just about getting from A to B, but it was a place to stop and reflect and maybe have some street performers and little gardens and things. So it's a very relaxed kind of staircase where people might actually meet and have some kind of civic experience. So these are some of the interior shots. We were working with LW, interior designer. And then just very quickly, because I haven't worked on this project or these projects directly, but this is some interesting work that we're doing now within Killa Design Marsal Arab project. And now what I've showed you so far is hospitality, but quite high rise, you could say. We also do what you might call a boutique hospitality, low rise kinds of things, where it's more about moments of spatial discovery. And we see that there's quite a bit of a trend for this kind of work these days, perhaps as the budgets are slightly reduced and the scale doesn't need to be as large as some of the towers and things. But I think that people are also appreciating the kind of what you might call barefoot billionaire experience. It's all about the kind of back to nature, back to simple things, back to being connected together, and that this is in a way many ways completely different from something like the Jumeirah Gate, which is a tower experience. This is all about experiencing the beach and the ocean nearby with some kind of boutique hotels, and these little spaces in between souks, arrival spaces and drop-offs. Oftentimes the work that we do in the Middle East is certainly in the kind of urban centers, is devoid of topography. In fact, the Vida that I showed you was quite interesting because there was a street level and there was a marina level. So in a sense, we had topography because we had to deal with that difference. But this was quite a nice project in Dibba, where we were asked to look at a kind of boutique hotel residence. And one of the things that we wanted to do here, again, this idea of connecting to nature, is make the landscaping very sympathetic. So we almost left the raw nature alone and set the architecture into that, creating these little slot view windows and things, so that as you're lying in bed or as you're in the pool, you can see the boulders and the natural flora and fauna. This was a spa element embedded into the cliff, and we quite like this sort of contrast between the raw earth and then the man-made projecting concrete elements. And this particular image down on the right corner, you can see the elevator cut into the raw earth. Some other views of that project. So we're also doing some residential projects, high-end villas. This is on that Marsal Arab site. And I think on this particular project, I think what's interesting is the level of sophistication that we're reaching now in BIM. This is completely designed, or let's say documented in BIM, including all of the ID and the MEP and the landscaping. And it's wonderful to have a team that's all working in the same platform. it can be quite frustrating. I'm sure many of you can appreciate trying to sort of import the CAD or having the CAD out of sync. And I think that there is a broader question about how long is it until we get rid of 2D drawings. I mean, if you think about it, 2D drawings is like it's like carving in stone. You know, the reason why the Roman letters have the little serif on the top is because when the guy was carving in stone, it was easier to carve it that way. And then later it became part of the way that the print font looked because of an old technology. So in the past, to describe a building, you had to draw 2D drawings. Today, to describe a building, it's all there in a 3D model. And really the bottleneck at the moment is that some of the consultants, let's say a cost consultant or even a contractor, is unable just to take a 3D model and assess it and tender it and build directly from the 3D model. But I would suspect in a very few number of years that we will start looking at the idea of producing 2D drawings to describe produce a 3D model to produce 2D drawings to build a 3D building will seem like a bit antiquated. And I do think that we spend an inordinate amount of time on the graphical elements of trying to get the 2D drawings out of the BIM. And if we spent that time just on working on the design, we could either do it faster or we could do it better and spend more time on the kind of the actual design element and less on the documentation. So I'd be interested to see if you have any comments on that at the end. Just a quick view of a project I did in Perkins and Will. This was also for the same client, EMAR, of the VIDA. And this was one of these cases where we knew that the client would probably change their mind, make the units bigger or smaller based on the market, etc. So it was a very simple gridded building at its base. But as I mentioned before, you know, the difference between building and architecture is some kind of exploration of an idea. And this particular idea was to see if we could get these terraces to work at the higher level so that the duplex units each would have these very large terraces with small pools overlooking. And fortunately, we were able to make it practically work in such a way that the client, which was quite risk-averse client, you know, agreed to that. And hopefully, it's something that stands on the skyline as being kind of recognizable in the kind of drop-off areas, interior spaces. This was a low-rise residential, but the trick here was, again, how do you take something that's optimal, very efficient planning and everything, but break it up and create sort of different volumes. So it was quite an aesthetic exercise in a way, but it was about trying to avoid a situation where this just looked like one huge inhumane kind of building. So this one is up in Dubai Hills, has just recently been constructed. Another mid-rise residential project. Here, the little experiment, as it were, was this idea of a vertical garden. We were fortunate enough to convince the client that they could lose the space of basically a studio apartment. And by losing that space of a studio apartment, we could create this vertical garden. And in fact, the whole branding of this project was based on the City Walk Central Park. And the idea was to pull the park up inside the building. And one of the challenges, perhaps not in Philippines, because I'm sure that planting grows extremely easily, but one of the challenges of integrating planting in a building is that if you integrate it in areas that are privately owned, you can't guarantee that it will be well maintained, and you can't force a resident to kind of water their plants or keep the same species and these types of things. So the idea of this vertical garden was it's just off the elevator lobby with the idea that the building operator, maintenance team would actually maintain these plants. So they are effectively public, not public open to the public, but public and open to the building residents to use. And again, this idea of trying to get the social connectivity in the building to improve by having these terraced balconies. So you could imagine somebody out there overlooking the city and maybe getting to know their upstairs neighbor, you know, in this kind of garden space. Because I tell you, elevators are no place to get to know people. It happens sometimes, but they're very awkward spaces because they're not really spaces. They're just on the way to somewhere else. This is another very interesting project. I haven't been directly involved in it, but this was a very tall residential tower that we're doing in Killa design. And the interesting thing here is about putting the structure on the outside of the building. When we got the project, all of the structure was inside the building. There was 1.5 meter thick shear walls. Basically, most of the unit was taken up by concrete. And by putting the structure on the outside of the building, we're able to free up all of that area inside. There's an icon tower competition. You might have seen this around town or in some in-flight magazines. Still waiting to see if that one is going forward. I just will touch very briefly on Museum of the Future. It's one of our most high-profile projects. It's quite sensitive project actually, so I can't go into too much detail about it. But it's really looking like it's going to be a really fantastic. And I went on a site visit the other day. The interiors are looking incredible, and you're seeing this. This is Arabic text on the skin of the building is actually glazed, so the light comes into the building through the Arabic poetry, which is written by Sheikh Mohammed, ruler of Dubai, and his vision for the future vision for the country. And so we're looking at some other kind of interesting cultural buildings in the future. Again, these are all quite sensitive, and I can't really go into it. But this idea of experimental buildings, I suppose Museum of the Future in a way is quite an experimental building. It's not following the conventional sort of tower floor plate, hyper efficient kind of scenario, the so-called more bread and butter type projects that we still try to make unique and special, but ultimately they're about a sort of financial feasibility. This is a cultural building, and therefore the way of measuring its value is quite different. I don't know if you've ever heard of this expression, the Bilbao effect. But Bilbao is a city in northern Spain which had not a very good reputation culturally. It is an industrial port basically, and they managed to convince the Guggenheim Museum to come to their city, and they managed to get Frank Gehry to build the Guggenheim Museum. And so this Bilbao effect is really about the amount of tourism that was generated from that decision. And it's a very interesting relationship between architecture and the broader economy. So a building like this is not really judged on its efficiency in terms of floor plate, but is more judged in terms of how many extra tourists might it bring to Dubai? What does it do for the brand image of Dubai? What does it do in terms of inspiring other projects to kind of go even beyond this? So I think in those terms, it's scored very highly, and I think Dubai is a great place to work as an architect, because there are clients, and the leadership here is willing sometimes to take quite significant risks in these kinds of projects, and that is not everywhere in the world that you get that ability. Another experimental building, this is going back some years, but I think it's quite an interesting one to mention. It's for an IT campus in Bangalore, in India, and I mentioned before that design creativity comes out of constraints, and the constraint here was that they had basically an undeveloped piece of land. There were some small sheds and things, but it was mostly jungle, and they want to put 25,000 people in this jungle. They want to keep all the trees. They want to keep the campus quality. They want to keep, and they also want to provide parking for all of that. So it was very, very challenging. Oh yeah, and also it was limited to 12 floors. So our original schemes had quite thin, tall towers that kept the ground plane more or less empty. But because the height limitation was there, we had to expand these buildings out. And we were working for a client that was very, very interested in sustainability, for ITC, that actually design all of their buildings according to the standards of LEED Platinum. And because they had done this many times before, they were very sophisticated actually, and really kept us on our toes. But even from the outset, from the master plan, we wanted to optimize from a sustainability perspective. So for example, this is actually the true north is up the page. And what that means is that the east and west facades are getting the least amount of solar gain, because they're very small facades against the low angle sun, and the prevailing wind was actually passing in this direction as well, so we managed to get many of the natural ventilation. And then we had this thing called the social bridge, which linked the project together. The This is the social bridge. And one of the problems that the client faced was that when anybody went to the canteen, which in the existing layout was a 20 minutes walk, let's say, from the building, they would lose all of that time in terms of productivity. Now, you could say that's a bit of an inhumane way of looking at it. But what we suggested was, why don't we put the canteen in the middle of the building, both in the middle in plan, but also in the middle in section, so people can walk only 6 floors down or 6 floors up into this social bridge, and that's where the connectivity can happen. So again, it's a kind of a common theme, but why is a campus a valuable asset for a company like ITC? It's because of the connectivity, because people are talking to each other. If you put people in a tower and you don't create opportunities for connectivity, you can really lose the intelligence and joined up thinking that comes out of an organization. So this was naturally ventilated space. The great thing about working in Bangalore is that it's a very, what do they call it, mild environment, and is quite suited to natural ventilation and these kinds of things. And in fact, we actually fought with the client to make sure that we didn't increase the AC requirement to sort of 18 degrees, but we kept it at 22 and just said people can wear t-shirts instead of, and save energy by changing the uniform of your staff. And so this was some of the built images from that project, from render to reality there. And one of the things I didn't mention was this idea of these terraces on the outside. These are landscape terraces. So when you walk, you obviously, they have elevators. You can choose to use an elevator. But if you want to walk to your lunch or go and see a friend or a colleague on another floor, you can actually walk down these landscape terraces one at a time. This was another experimental project that is a competition, actually. And the competition brief specifically said they don't want a landmark building. And it is an odd thing to say, because as an architect, you kind of hope to make some landmarks. But it got us thinking, and we thought, well, if we can't make a mark on the land, then maybe we should just make the building out of the land, that it is landscape itself. So we were inspired by the shapes that you see in the wadis and these very natural curvilinear forms. So it is a very understated kind of architecture that basically melts into the landscape. And we managed to win on that project. I think the other thing that was kind of interesting about it from an experimental point of view was this idea of spill air. Even in my office where I go every day, I notice this phenomenon of spill air. There's a small passage leading to the front door. And whenever the front door opens, a gust of cold air comes out. And I always think to myself, if you were a cafe owner, you would have free AC here, basically all year. Or if not all year, at least it's extending the life of the cafe outside for, say, 3 months or something. So one of the ideas in this project was that we had this courtyard, a lower courtyard, and that all of the spill air from the hotel, and of course you make a well-sealed building, but there's always going to be some openings and door openings and things like that. And remember that cold air falls, just like in a freezer in the supermarket. It doesn't need to have a lid on top. The cold air is trapped inside the walls of the freezer. And so the same approach was applied here to have a lowered courtyard space, capturing the spill air and making it more usable for longer months of the year. We're not saying that it's air conditioned outside for all year, absolutely not. But what we're saying is perhaps by early September, it starts being 3 or 4 degrees cooler in that courtyard, and that's enough to get people able to sit outside. So Nico, how are we doing for time? Because I've just now only started on the topic of today's conversation.
Very good, very good. You can continue.
Yeah. But what is the? It's been 1 hour, I think, now. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you can continue. You're done.
Yeah,
okay,
yes.
because
everybody's waiting for this office of the future.
Everybody's waiting for this one. Okay, fine. Because I have a short presentation and a long one, and what I was going to do is basically make the short presentation and then play a short video about this project, and then I think maybe since obviously people have dialed in for this particular project, I'm happy to maybe talk about it a little bit more following some questions, if that works for everybody.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so this project is called the Office of the Future. It's not our name, by the way. The name was given to us by the client. I think it's you know, to claim something is of the future is always a bit like, oh, okay, maybe in your opinion, it's Office of the Future. But the idea of this building was to be the first 3D printed and fully occupied building. Now, there have been examples of other 3D printing used particularly in sort of academic and research circles where people have used a conventional 3D printer perhaps to make a kind of a plastic elements that are then glued together. And they make what I would call 3D printed pavilions. But a pavilion and an occupied building, particularly in Dubai with a very, you know, challenging environment, are quite different things. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about this is it's the 3D printed structure. Which you can see just here. Let me make the screen a little bit bigger. This element here is an example of the 3D printed structure, which these different parts of the building are made out of. Let me see. Okay, so this here is the completed building. The site itself is quite prominent. Just at the foot of the Emirates Towers in Dubai, opposite to DIFC. And you know, it's one thing to do an experimental architecture kind of in the garden of the architecture school or in your own backyard or something, but it's quite different to do it right in the middle of the financial center of Dubai, and also when the completion date is already set within the ruler's diary. And I think as a general point, it's often quite hard to do research and development on a time frame. You know, if you're going to really do something that's, let's say, academically or philosophically pure, you can't be constrained by time frame and commercial and kind of somebody's schedule. You know what I mean? And this was a strange mix of something that needed to be done for a kind of publicity factor. But at the same time, many people were very interested in seeing what could be done in terms of the 3D printing. And I'm going to flick through a couple of images, and I think, yeah, I think we probably will have time to do a slightly a longer presentation if you want. But the office was basically made up of two components. One, this more public end that you can see here. This is like a gallery space, and then the office spaces here. One of the things that we really wanted to do, again, doesn't matter how advanced your technology or how innovative or whatever, the basic requirements of architecture remain the same. Views, natural light, security, public to private relationships. And this was no different, relationship to nature as well. So these trees were actually existing on the site, and we shuffled the different 3D printed elements around so that we could keep the trees that were already living. And we also shuffled the 3D printed elements so that we could get natural light coming into the depth of the spaces. You can see here, when you can see on the left bottom corner, a sort of a render of a 3D printed building. And you know, this was before the term fake news, but there was a lot of fake news going on about 3D printing. And I think the reason is because first of all, it captures the public imagination, and also it's potentially a very big market. So quite a few of the contractors that are like starting to explore, and this was some years ago, starting to explore 3D printed architecture, would kind of promise the earth with the idea that if they made the promise and won the job, then they'd figure out the details later. So be very, very careful whenever you're working with something innovative. There's this sort of chicken and egg thing for the innovator. They need the project, they need the funding, they need the investment. And so they'll sometimes make things look a bit more sorted out than they actually are. And in this age of sort of hyper-realistic renderings, photoshopping, and sort of fake news, be very careful about being oversold something on the kind of technological cutting edge. So when I first got involved in the job, I thought, well, where's our 3D printing robot? And let's go and see him on the site, because that, of course, is what you would expect from a 3D printed situation. In this particular case, because the time frame was very limited, we had to get the 3D printed elements completed in China and then ship them into the location. So it is basically 3D printed elements assembled on the site. But of course, the idea of 3D printed architecture is that you can bring raw materials directly to the site and 3D print the shape there. And of course, it's some benefits like being able to work all through the night and avoid human labor, things like this. But you have to remember that, you know, it's only one robot versus, say, 1,000 people. And in many parts of the world, and I'm sure in Philippines, it's actually easier to get 1,000 people to work on a job than it is to get a robot, and then to fix that robot and to have all the expertise around that robot working. And the thing about building industry is that it moves very, very slowly because it is so collaborative, and it relies on the whole of society moving forward with the idea. So there will, I'm sure, be a time when 3D printed architecture becomes more common. But for now, it's probably very much limited to things that really need the ability of 3D printed, 3D printing concrete printers to make complex forms and shapes. And I think they're probably more suited to the kind of a factory environment where you get 3D printed elements coming from the factory and then being assembled on site. So what I thought I could do, if it works for you, is just share a short video which is about the Office of the Future, which I think explains things. It's not that I can't talk about it, it's just that I think time is short, and like I say, I think we can in the end. Can everybody hear the audio?
It's not playing yet.
Sorry, just wanted to make sure, did you get the audio?
No, sir.
Yes.
No.
No. Oh, okay. That's strange. Okay, so let me just talk over the imagery. I'll turn the audio right down. And so this is the Office of the Future here. This is the completed building you can see at the foot of the Emirates Towers. And basically, I'm just talking about the fact that we're at the beginning of a new era in 3D printed possibilities. These are some shots from inside. And so if I just pause the movie here, the white elements are the 3D printed concrete elements sitting on some conventional foundations, and we call these cassettes. And so they were assembled on site. You can see this is an animation of the plotter, and that's the actual plotter there, printing like a concrete truss. And what you'll see is that in between these concrete layers is actually some rebar, which was laid by hand. I think it's important to remember that concrete structures are actually concrete and steel structures. They're not just concrete. So when people talk about 3D printed concrete,
Ben, excuse me, I think
that there's a steel element.
Sorry,
Yeah,
Ben,
the
excuse me.
presentation is not working actually.
We could not see your
And the other
presentation.
challenge of 3D printed concrete is that normal concrete is cast and becomes one thing, whereas 3D printed concrete is layers. And
Hi, Ben. Sorry,
bonds-
excuse me.
Ah.
The presentation is not working.
Oh, okay. You mean the video is not coming through?
Yeah, the video is not coming.
Okay.
It's only the PDF.
Only the, oh, sorry. Okay. I wonder if give me 1 second here. I think I might need to share the,
Yeah, share the video.
okay. Share. Sorry, you should have stopped me. Is it visible now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you like me to start again?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Yes,
sorry.
please. Yes, please.
Okay. And how's the audio? If I can you hear the audio now?
Yeah.
There's an
In a low
option.
volume.
There's an
Audio-
option
no.
wherein you can share your audio of your computer.
Okay, let me see if there is an mute.
View.
Same as system audio settings. Look, I'll just talk over it because I can basically explain. I don't want to waste people's time with too much IT. So let me turn this down a little bit. So you can see the model of the office at the bottom there. And this helps to give a sense of the scale. So this was the first thing I wanted to talk about, was that you can see the white elements here are the structural elements of the project that were 3D printed. And then the red are the foundations that they're sitting on. And then the whole thing was clad in an ephes type system for insulation. So this is the actual plotting machine. And I was mentioning before that the rebar is added in between, I think it's every 12 layers. And that whenever talking about any concrete structure, strictly speaking, it's concrete and steel working together. And I think this relates to my point before about it is a slightly strange world that we live in, where we design a building as a model in 3D and then spend a huge amount of time turning it into 2D and then turn it back into 3D and hope that there's nothing lost in translation. And of course there usually is. So it's kind of like we're a little bit stuck with the way things have been done in the past. And I think that perhaps more important than this idea of 3D printed buildings, it's not about the printer, but it's about the way that you communicate a building to the people who build it. And I think the appeal of 3D printed buildings is you just send the model to the printer and you get a building. But you can more or less do the same thing, or we should be able to do more or less the same thing with a contractor. Here's the model, print it. I mean, print it through your, metaphorically, through your systems, through your people. And this was my colleague Hatem. He was actually working for the European Space Agency after this project. And this was the idea of bringing in the daylight and things into the space. So just because we have a fancy technology doesn't mean we forget about the ancient requirements. And you can see the natural light there coming through. So these are the different spaces. And I think the key thing here is that there are definitely 3D printed structures that have been made before, pavilion type things, but not used as an actual building. And so in a way, it's the idea of 3D printing something and then it becoming just part of the normal city. That's quite new. And that's what won this building a Guinness Book of Records as the first fully occupied 3D printed building. And this is the big tree that we saved by moving the building down a little bit. And you can just see here the actual 3D printed quality. And we wanted to leave a panel now to reveal the actual innate quality. I think that in 3D printed buildings in the future can actually celebrate this. I mean, it's a bit like brick or stone or timber. They all have their own individual qualities that can be celebrated. It doesn't necessarily need to be covered. And I think a little bit like the museum, it's not a building that's about efficiency or even economic feasibility. People often ask, how much did it cost and this kind of thing. I mean, in this particular case, the contractor was doing it basically as a showcase. So it's difficult to say how much it cost, but that's not really the point. The purpose of this building was to showcase that Dubai is at the forefront of new construction technology and that it is possible to try new things and new technologies and pull it off. And I don't know if you heard the point at the end, but it's all about building things that are better, more livable, more humane. Again, it's all about trying to help make the world a better place and make people have a better time in it. So let me just go back to I think that we're pretty much at the end of the presentation now. Share this one. Okay. So that was Office of the Future. Other research and development that we do in the office is solar panel analysis and PV analysis and those kinds of things. And so I'd just like to end off by saying, hopefully in some kind of accent that you can understand, Salamat sa pagkakataong magpakita nagyong at pagpalain ka nig Dios. I don't make any sense, but
It makes
really
sense, yes.
a great pleasure to present to you all.
Thank you for trying.
Again, deeply honored to have such a turnout. So with that, if there's any kind of questions from the panel of experts or from anybody else in the audience, maybe if you route them through to Nico or Christian, that would be great. Thank you again.
Something for Christian, please.
Is
Sound.
Aklan Baraka here?
Question?
I think, Christian, I'll start the reaction from Bahrain chapter. Good afternoon, Benjamin Piper. How do you pronounce it? Piper or Peeper?
Piper, yeah.
Yeah,
Actually, there's
Peter
an extra.
Piper.
It's yeah. It's
Yeah,
Piper. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for that wonderful, design process that you have shared to us during the first part of your presentation and towards the actual 3D printed future building of Dubai. I 3 points that I have taken from your talk is about, first is the concept of design narrative, whereas every Filipino architect will tend to look into what is the use, how it's going to be used, and who is the people using it. Those kind of design narratives is always under design. For example, if you're going to design a hospital, it will be letter H.
Right.
Those kind of design narratives. And also, one more point is that design should be self-explanatory. There are buildings all over the world that you need to ask the guard, where is the lift? Where is the toilet? No, it should be like the design should be self-explanatory. That this is towards the lift area, this is the reception, and this is the open canteen area. And the third part is that building should be a part of the economic growth of a country. It should be an income generating edifice. It should not be like a stagnant box that no one tends to look into.
Mhm.
And on the 3D printed design, well, as you have said, you've done it in Dubai, made story for us, Filipino architects, especially the student that is in the audience. Thank you, Benjamin.
My pleasure. Well, thank you for your comments. Really appreciate that.
Good evening, Sir Benjamin Piper.
Hi.
I'm Jennifer from Aklan, Boracay. So thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation for today.
My pleasure.
Probably after all the projects that you have shown us, most of the participants are now inspired to work in abroad, especially now in Dubai, because of all these innovative projects. So right now, my only takeaway for this presentation is that, especially for everyone, because we have so many WAPSA students that are present now. So just to remind that, you know, architects, just what I'm always telling my on the job trainees, that we architects are actually inventors, innovators. So don't be afraid. Let's not be afraid to get out of the box. Because sometimes
Sure.
here in the Philippines, it's really hard to get, you know, clients who are really willing to go on your vision. So, you know, for everyone, just not to be to feel down on those stuff. So just don't forget to share your talents, because we are all trained.
Question popping into your mind. The only way you're ever going to find out in your life, in your career, is to ask. And too
Yes.
many times, I've seen it before. Actually, I used to be the same in the I would join client meetings or something as a young architect. I would think, oh, I better not open my mouth because I might say something stupid. But in my career, and as my confidence has increased, I open my mouth and I don't care if it sounds stupid, because I want to know, because I need to know. It's my job to know. And if I don't know it, the worst thing I can do is not ask. So there's no such thing as a foolish question. And I encourage architects to look at their career as a career of lifelong learning.
Yes, that's true. The learning that. So thank you very much.
Sure.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jay Bertoldo from Abu Dhabi.
Hi.
Hi, Ben. First of all, thank you to you, Ben Piper, for sharing your time to us and for doing this presentation, which I believe inspired a lot of our attendees to do their best in all their works, and also to not be afraid to ask questions, because I think that's the key takeaway here. Do not be afraid to speak out and be heard in the office or wherever you work.
Yeah.
I admire the philosophy of the Killa designs that you showed us earlier, and how you align your designs to the context of the place that requires different layers of quality. I really like the way when you said that you do designs to lift spirits by creating experiences to the users that are unique to each of your projects. I also admire the advancement of the 3D printing building technology that you used in the Dubai Future Foundation Pavilion, or the Office of the Future, and all the benefits that you can get from it, like innovation in construction technology, the speed of construction, sustainability, and the others. I know that you also mentioned that the technology is still not that common, but what if the robot technology advances? And I know that you mentioned earlier that at the moment you still need 1,000 workers and experts to support these machines. However, I cannot help it but to still think about this question. Like with any other technology, will these advancement in in the robotics technology for buildings, will this kill the opportunities for the workers? And also, I'm thinking, I do hope that this 3D printing technology is more than a fad. Like, I know that you talk about the office of the future, but do you think this can be applied to address any other issues that we have right now, like the housing crisis, not only in some countries, but globally, especially in the Philippines? Do you think that this innovation can be used to address that issue, and these can reach more shores and help more people to dream of owning a house and achieve that dream of theirs? So that's my key takeaway and my questions to you. And again, thank you for sharing your Killa designs to us.
Sure. Well, look, I think those are, you've touched on some really interesting themes in your commentary. Quite a few themes, actually. I should have been taking notes. But one of the themes that you mentioned was this idea of let's say automated production or robotic production or 3D printing, taking away opportunities for employment.
Yes.
I would answer that in two ways. First of all, I don't think that necessarily the role of the laborer on site is necessarily such a great opportunity. It is sometimes dangerous. It may not be really a career. It's a kind of a labor job. It's not a growth type of job. Okay, a few may move through a career based from laboring into construction management and things like that. But it isn't really a job that need to be preserved. But I do agree that, of course, you need to keep people in employment, and you need to keep the economy rolling and things like that. But I think, as I mentioned before, that when you have a new kind of framework for building production, it has to be supported by people. So the guy that might have been laying bricks, that gets his job replaced by the robot laying bricks or the printing concrete or whatever, then he can be fixing the robot, or he can be building the robot in the factory, and this type of thing. So as one industry sort of fades, new industries come up. And I don't think that we'd have the danger of sort of robots putting laborers out of work. They may need to change their role, which I personally think would be a good thing for everybody, because there's better ways to be spending one's time, let's say, if possible. But I do think that to answer the second part of the question, will this be a primary way to solve housing issues? And I have to say, I really don't think so. The 3D printed technology is very suited to places, scenarios where you want to control the geometry in a very precise way, because that's what you can do with this robotic technology. But the housing crisis is more about production, scale of production, which involves kind of repetitive elements that don't need to be uniquely 3D printed. They can be manufactured, or let's say precast, for example, or they can be manufactured in other ways more cost effectively, more quickly. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the vast majority of buildings in the world, probably 98% of them, don't have anything to do with architects, and possibly don't even have anything to do with contractors. They're informal kind of settlements or self-build type of settlements. And I think if we want to make a difference in terms of raising the standard from the bottom in those kinds of areas, it's more to do with land ownership rights, with teaching proper methods of construction that are safe. So for example, if there's an earthquake or a hurricane, that there's not a lot of injury from poorly built buildings, perhaps material supply. And I think one of the problems that we face in the world in general today is because we're so mobile, we used to be much more responsible for our immediate environment. But today, in today's world, we don't have an immediate environment. We might work, in one city and travel to another for our accommodations. We might even be a global citizen living in a completely different country. So that idea of having a small piece of land that you that you live off of, and that you build a quality kind of your own quality accommodation is sort of breaking down. And I think that this is problematic. And what ends up happening is you get huge urban slums, conurbations, where individual has no vested interest in building quality or in investing in that place. And whoever is building the accommodations is really doing it at the lowest possible end. So I think if we can look at trying to make the rules around cities and city growth and the kind of frameworks for city growth stronger, and particularly in the area of informal housing, that is probably where to really make a difference. The 3D printed concrete is more like for your hotel lobby that has this incredible form, would be too costly to build or carve, but the new technology allows you to do that. But I don't think it's going to be playing a role of providing accommodations for people, or building hospitals or schools and these kind of things in a cheaper, faster way than other methods.
All
Yeah,
right.
thank you for sharing your thoughts and ideas to us. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Well, let's call on architect Felino Palafox Jr.
Hi Ben, June Palafox here.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for sharing. Very insightful, inspiring, informative. You said about what if. What if this pandemic, COVID-19 is, I'm told, mutating very fast. So we could have a COVID-19, 20, 21, 22, 23, or the rest of our lives. What will impact on the shape of buildings and cities? And I'm also a member of CTBUH. What's the future of tall buildings? Like Dubai, vertical city.
Sure. Well, I think it's a great question and very apt for the current times. I think that COVID, from an urban and global and environmental standpoint, COVID is a blessing in disguise, because essentially it's made us. There was a bit of a theme running through what I was talking about before, about old ways of doing things living on are irrelevant. And this conference, for example, perhaps pre-COVID, we would have all assembled in a great hall in the Philippines. Maybe I would have flown over there, had a really nice time. Many people would have traveled many miles, and yes, great experience, but at what cost? And I think it's actually a wonderful thing that COVID has forced people to think, you could say, be more creative under the constraints. And society is changing, and I actually hope that many aspects of it remain changed. This idea of having to physically travel, to get things done is not really true. And it's, of course, incredibly expensive in environmental terms and, financial terms. I think the idea of true mixed use, where you don't need to leave your building to get everything that you need, is a fantastic idea. And it's not because of the idea of people should be trapped in their buildings, not at all. People should be free to leave and enjoy nature and other parts of the city. But the real shame, I find, is when you're driving on a big highway and you think all the people driving in the other direction are going to where I've come from, and I'm going in the other direction, and we all basically need the same thing. So it doesn't make sense for all of us to be moving so much through our cities for more or less the same thing. We're not moving because we want to go to the theater, or we want to go to a cultural event, or we want to visit a friend on an occasion. We're moving for basic things like getting to school, getting to a job, getting some basic shopping, or maybe we're doing some government-related activities. But all of those kind of staple activities should be possible without the incredible sort of load on the environment. And imagine a city in the future where the roads were really just experiences, parks, basically, where you could cycle or maybe occasionally drive, and that the sort of 40% of most cities are taken up by the infrastructural requirement to keep everybody connected. And I truly hope that we can still be connected, but we don't have to be connected physically. And this will save a huge amount of energy and space, for the world, and make us really reflect on what is important, in our life experience, and really focus on that.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. One school of thought is that the future of buildings or architecture will be like healthcare facilities. So the challenge for architects maybe give the aesthetics to this healthcare facility looking buildings and homes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the other thing that this whole COVID issue raises, and it's polarized people, it's like healthcare, but at what cost? Because ultimately, if you're only interested in survival, you should stay in your room and never go outside. That's probably the best thing to do. But life isn't about survival. Life is about living. Life is about experiences. Life is about challenges, putting yourself out there. So I think it does raise this whole question of, should our buildings be all about just safety, or is it safety but also experience? And sometimes experience is not necessarily the safest thing to do. So if we're designing an infinity pool, does it need to have, you know, a 2-meter glass edge that prevents you from having the view? Do you have to put the balustrading everywhere? And sometimes I think as architects we come up against this, trying to make a better experience, but we're somehow constrained by the politically correct things that we must all do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go now to the Q&A.
Okay, so should I answer what I see on the screen, Christian?
Yeah. Yes. We have a host for the Q&A.
Okay.
Hi, Architect Ben. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Yen Mercado. I'm representing UAP San Pablo. So we have gathered series of questions from your audience tonight. So for your first question, what software are you using for design and structural?
Yeah. Well, we mostly are using BIM, Rivet, I should say, as our main documentation program. But having said that, many times in the early stages of concept, we might use Rhino or SketchUp, or really any program that is desired and suited to the situation. For structures, we're using to be honest, I couldn't give you the specific programs there as I'm not a structural engineer, but I know that they are obviously using Rivet to document, but they're using other tools to analyze. And it's a bit unfortunate that the analysis tools and the documentation tools are not the same. So for example, if we make small changes in the documentation of the structure, it can sometimes frustrate the engineer because he has to update his other model. And I wish that these two things were, you know, the same. And that you just press a button and say, yep, we're good to go, no problem, we can make that small change.
Yes, correct. Actually, my husband is a structural engineer, so I understand.
So are you always requesting small changes?
Actually, big changes at times. So that question is from our UAPSA member, Felipe Havellanar. Actually, he's an architect from Bahrain, Felipe Havellanar. So I'm passing the host to Architect Miggs.
Hello. So there's another question here.
Okay.
From Architect Jason.
Yep.
Can we ask Ben the challenge they faced in designing the skin facade of Museum of the Future?
Sure. Well, it's a great question. And also, Jason, I'd just like to mention that I used to work in Shanklin Cox in Al Ain. So from one Shanklin Cox brother to another, thank you very much for your question. Look, there were many challenges in Museum of the Future. I would talk about two specifically. One was how to map the calligraphy onto the skin in the model. And Hattem, who you saw before, who went off and worked for the European Space Agency after helping us out on the museum and and the 3D printed office, figured out a way to basically map in, I think he was using Max, a texture map of the calligraphy in such a way that it could be traced onto the surface of that form. But it was challenging. It was also very challenging to get the 2D sections looking good, because it needed some thickness in the way that it was modeled. So that was the digital production. In terms of the physical production, one of the things that was challenging was how to bond the stainless steel onto the fiberglass GR underlay in such a way that it would come off. Because if you think about a steel, when you press it onto a curve, it becomes under there's either tremendous tension or tremendous compression. And the stainless steel has these small, what we call divots. It's like they're little bumps. And the idea originally was that as the stainless steel is stretched onto this curve, that the bumps would allow a little bit of stretch in the material. But in reality, particularly for the tighter curves, it didn't work, and the steel kept coming off the fiberglass. So in the end, and this was quite late in the whole design production, but in the end, the stainless steel was laser cut into little hexagon shapes. And the laser cut meant that there was about a 1 millimeter gap between each of these hexagons. And the thing about a hexagon is that it can tessellate in any direction. So it's a little bit like, in a way, you could almost think of them as tiles, and that each tile would then move along the double curved surface. And if you do visit the museum in the future, as I'm sure many of you will be able to, you look very carefully at the skin, you'll see these little hexagon shapes cut out of the metal. And what I like about that is it's where the production of a building actually has an impact on the aesthetic of the building. Like with the 3D printed concrete, you can see those lines. So in this case, in the museum, because of the production of that surface, it now has those hexagons, which is a functional and technical requirement, but it also has an aesthetic kind of element, adds an aesthetic element to the design.
Thank you, Architect Ben. For the next question, Nix, can you flash it on the screen? This is from Reisha Yularan of Cebu chapter. Your buildings have very unique forms. How does your team strike a balance between form and function, especially when culture is a primary consideration?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question, Raisia. Look, I think that when you say the word function, that there are many different functions for many different kind of buildings. So in the presentation, I showed, for example, a residential tower, the Vida project. Its function was to be a residential tower and to be efficient and to be financially feasible for the developer. In the case of the museum, which is of course a completely different form, its function is to attract tourists to Dubai and to put Dubai on a cultural map. So I believe that they're both, the form is following the function in both cases. And you couldn't say that one is more or less functional than the other. The point is that the functions are very different. So you get different forms there. And I think that more or less we follow a kind of form follows function approach. But I think when the phrase was first coined, the idea of function was quite limited. It was more like, well, people need to walk in this way or move here or sleep there. But there are more functions to a building than just the sort of basic movements within them. They may have other functions, like they should sell better than another building that has a less attractive shape. And one of the things that you find particularly in Dubai market and in any market that is sort of based on the idea of off, one of the most important functions of a design is to attract people and encourage them to at least inquire, if not buy, the unit. And sometimes this is based on the shape and form. And that's why you get many odd-looking buildings in Dubai, because part of their function is to attract people's attention.
Thank you.
Answer the question?
Another question, Mix, can you?
This is a follow-up question from Jason.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's in addition, can we ask for the towers that they designed, how flexible was the FAR to get the proportion of the towers?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, FAR generally, let's say from the architect to the client, the FAR is not flexible. You know, and basically we always meet the brief. And it's worth mentioning, I think, that you know, you can always hit the target more or less bang on. Efficiencies is harder, but you can always observe the total saleable area allowed by the FAR. I would say, however, that the client to the city would often pay extra money to get more FAR and things like that. And actually, because as an architect, you're perfectly balancing the design and absorbing the FAR. And then if the client goes off and either they say they'll get more, but they don't, or they say that they'll get more and they do, and then you have to redesign. It's quite frustrating because is one of the fundamental constraints of a project. It means all of the constraints have changed, and it happens sometimes.
Very much. I'll pass it off to Nico. Nico, do you have another question?
Yes, for the next question is from architect Sarah Abdiya. When given such a large property to work, when given such a large property to work on for a master plan, what is the key requirement to jumpstart the master plan design? What is your priority? Is it the green space or the roads or the buildings requirements first?
Yeah. I think it's a really great question. And actually, it's a question, I don't think that there's a specific answer to this question. In a way, the answer to the question is the process of master planning, because you have so many different constraints that are all going on in parallel. You might, for example, say, well, I want to make the roads very easy to drive around, but I might want to make the parks very big and, you know, joyful. I might want the buildings all very iconic and stand out, but I might want to make the city kind of clear to understand. So I don't think in master planning and in design in general, but master planning in particular, there's no kind of overriding constraint. But having said that, it's very useful when you have multiple sort of factors to try to think about the priority. And in a way, as a designer, you are defining the priority, your priority of a given design problem, and in this case, master planning. So come to a master plan and say, you know what, I'm going to make this master plan the most efficient road system, first point of priority. Or you might say, I'm going to make this master plan the greenest kind of master plan. And so there's many ways into it. I don't think one can say what one has to respond to what the client is looking for, what the site has to offer, what the context is, and kind of respond to that situation with the appropriate prioritization of the different conflicting requirements of a master plan. That doesn't seem like I've tried to escape the question. I genuinely think a kind of formula, and in fact, formula is very dangerous in design because that means that the thing is not being responsive.
All right. For the last question, actually, it's my personal question. For Ben, were you able to come to a point where your great visions, because all of it has really nice concepts, were you being limited or constricted due to the funds of the client?
Well, look, I think there's two things I would like to say about that. One is that that I remember when I first came to UAE, and I came from the UK actually, and in UK the whole issue of funding was much more certainly at the time, because I came in 2006, and it was sort of the beginning of boom time in Dubai. And so, for example, I was doing some extensions to houses in the UK, and I came to Dubai and I was doing towers on Sheikh Zayed Road, which was like a huge change. And I was like, wow, this is great. Like, these clients have all this money to spend or whatever. But it didn't necessarily, I actually found that the clients that had less money to spend and cared more about their money were the more realistic clients that actually built their buildings. And it's in fact one of the reasons why Dubai has been very successful, I think, is because they don't have their wealth is generated on trade and development. Their wealth is not generated by a natural resource. Whereas in Abu Dhabi, their wealth is based on a natural resource, and their ability to kind of conceive and procure and construct buildings, they can of course do it, but given the wealth that they have, they could do much more than what Dubai has done. But Dubai has done, it has achieved more ambitious projects because they understand the dynamic. And I actually think that a client that has less money and is more careful with their money is a more serious client, basically. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point, which is a reiteration, is that constraint helps creativity. And there's no such thing as no budget, but there is such a thing as a loose budget where nobody really knows what's going on. People design stuff, then we find out a year later it's too expensive, then it gets value engineered, it gets watered down, that type of thing. It's actually very healthy for if a client says, we want to do the least costly building that's ever been done in the world. That's a really interesting question. And you start thinking, well, what are different ways that we could do this? So I don't think that we've been constrained by costs. It's our job to respond to that constraint. That's like saying, have you been constrained by the size of your land? Well, yeah, we've been constrained, but if we didn't have a size of land, we wouldn't know what to do. So it's a good thing to have the constraint. There have, of course, been many times that we've had the so-called value engineering, which we don't like, because value engineering in this region basically means cost cutting. But real value engineering is where you ask, what is the value of something? And is it worth keeping it for this cost? Or indeed, is it worth paying more to get more value? Because value and cost are two different things. And I think that unfortunately, because the architectural design tends to be very visible, architecture is often cut, like the balconies or the garden or the sculpture or something that's visible. Something like MEP or structures is so technical that it's quite hard to value engineer it, unless of course you have a technical team doing that. But and there is of course VE in structures and MEP and other technical disciplines. But I sometimes feel as an architect, the client and the client body takes more pot shots at the architecture because it's something they understand and they can delete. Whereas they're less confident saying, oh, let's just delete all of this chilled water plant, or take out this sewage system, or make the concrete X amount thinner. And so I think one of the roles that we have as architects is really to try to defend our original design, because hopefully, in fact, many times I've done a VE where I've been asked to sign the VE as my recommendation. And I always say to the client, this is not my recommendation. If it was the recommendation, I would have made it at the beginning. We already recommended what we felt was the most balanced design that gave you the most value for money, because we don't want to waste our clients' money. If you want to reduce the value of the project by deleting this thing, please, we support that. But we ask you to instruct us to do that because we don't believe in it. And this is sometimes quite hard to actually get clients to do that because they get nervous about the idea of it being the wrong decision. And they rather that the architect make a wrong decision and delete something. And then so usually the project manager gets involved and they just sign it off as the middleman kind of thing. But all I'm saying to you and to the other architects and aspiring architects and students is trust in your instinct. Be prepared to defend your position, and people will respect you more for it. And your job as an architect is to get the best quality building. It's not your job to make the cheapest building. It's not your job to make lots of money for your client. It's your job to leave the world with well-constructed, well-designed things that will last a long time.